You have heard this one repeated as settled fact. On social media, in self-help books, sometimes even from a doctor. The human brain, and specifically the frontal lobe, the part responsible for judgment and impulse control, is not fully developed until age 25. It gets used to explain a bad decision, to justify a car insurance rate, to argue that anyone under 25 should not be fully trusted with major choices. There is one problem. Neuroscientists who actually study brain development say that is not what the evidence shows. And never really was. New large-scale brain imaging research published this year adds even more detail to why the number 25 was always a rough guess dressed up as a hard deadline. Before you use this claim to explain your last questionable text message, or dismiss someone younger than 25, let us sort the signal from the noise. Trace this claim back and it does not lead to a single study that found brains finish at 25. It leads to a set of brain imaging studies from the late 1990s and early 2000s that tracked how gray matter, the brain's processing tissue, changes through adolescence. Those studies were genuinely rigorous. And they found real, dramatic changes through the teenage years. But the researchers running them mostly stopped scanning participants around age 20. Simply because that is where their funding and study design ended. Not because brain development stopped there. Later scientists and science writers, looking at where the data trailed off, estimated that maturation likely wrapped up sometime in the mid-20s. And 25 became the popular shorthand. In other words, the number was never a discovered endpoint. It was an educated guess about what came after the last data point. And the guess is the part that went viral. This year, researchers analyzed brain scans from more than 4,200 people, spanning from infancy all the way to age 90. A far larger and wider range than the studies that produced the original 25 estimate. Rather than finding one clean finish line, they identified several distinct phases of brain development, including a long window running from roughly age 9 up through the early 30s, during which the brain's wiring and network efficiency, meaning how quickly and effectively different brain regions communicate with each other, continue to change measurably. That is not the same as saying the brain is unfinished or unreliable until your 30s. It means maturation is a long, gradual, continuous process with no single dramatic cutoff, closer to how height gradually stabilizes over years rather than stopping on a birthday. The headline takeaway from the researchers themselves was not a new magic number. It was that the old one never should have existed. Understand why a debunked number keeps circulating. It is genuinely useful, which is different from being true. 25 gives a tidy, memorable, science-sounding explanation for messy human behavior. From a risky decision to a breakup handled badly. It shows up constantly on social media platforms as a punchline for regret. And it gets repeated by people with real authority. Teachers, parents, even some clinicians, who heard it once and never checked the original research. Neuroscientists who study this area point out something important. There is no strong evidence that people below 25 are meaningfully worse at decision making than people who just crossed that birthday. And no evidence of a sudden jump in judgment the day someone turns 25. The myth persists because it is simple and a little bit comforting. Not because the brain scans ever actually supported a hard stop at that specific age. Here is where this needs real nuance. Debunking the 25 myth does not mean brain development is a myth, or that adolescent brains are identical to adult ones. The original 1990s and 2000 studies were solid science. And it remains true that impulse control, planning, And emotional regulation genuinely do keep strengthening through the teenage years and into early adulthood. That part is well supported. What is not supported is treating 25 as a hard biological deadline. A light switch that flips from undeveloped to developed. The newer 4,000-person study is also not the final word. It identifies broad statistical phases across a population, not a specific check you can run on any one individual's brain. No brain scan can currently tell you, personally, whether your judgment is fully mature. Treat both the old myth and the new research the same way, as evidence about population trends, not as a verdict on any specific person's brain. Quick recap. The claim that your brain, specifically your frontal lobe, is not fully developed until exactly 25 was never based on a study that found that endpoint. It was an estimate built from where older research happened to stop scanning. Newer research covering more than 4,000 people finds development continuing in some measurable ways well into the 30s, with no single dramatic cutoff at any age. So, signal or noise, mostly noise, on the specific number 25 in the idea of a hard biological finish line. Signal, on the underlying truth that judgment and self-control genuinely do keep maturing gradually well past the teenage years, just without a birthday attached. Next time someone cites 25 as brain science fact, you now know the honest version. It was always a guess wearing a lab coat. Subscribe for the viral science claims checked against what the actual research says. Signal from the noise. Every week.